Hi, a very warm welcome to all our faculty and delegates participating in this workshop on critical incidents in obstetric anesthesia. As you're all well aware, in spite of having several guidelines, protocols, and good clinical practice, sometimes there are some near misses and critical incidents when we are providing anesthesia care to parturients. This is because there are several human factors and system related factors which lead to these mishaps and lead to errors. So, the aim of today's workshop is to identify these factors which lead to near misses and critical incidents in obstetric anesthesia and see how we can avoid them and thus prevent these. So, we will first of all begin with an introductory lecture by Dr. Sunil Pandya, who needs no introduction at all. He is the president of the Association of Obstetric Anesthesiologists of India. He's, in fact, a walking encyclopedia of obstetric anesthesia. After this lecture, we will move on to the scenarios. We actually have 4 scenarios today. All these have been filmed in the simulation center by Dr. Sunil Pandya and by Dr. Manokant, and each depicts one critical incident. So after the scenarios are played, we will run through the videos again and we'll have a discussion about each scenario as to what went right and what went wrong. You can also put in your questions and suggestions in the chat box. We will try to discuss as many of those as possible in the available time. We will then conclude the workshop with some key take-home points. So let's get going. I would like to introduce you to the faculty participating in this workshop. Dr. Sunil Pandya, Senior Consultant, AIG Hospitals and President of AOA. Dr. Lalit Raigar, Professor and Head of Anesthesia, R&T Medical College, Udaipur. Dr. Akhilandeshwari, Professor of Anesthesia, Sri Ramachandra Medical College, Chennai. Dr. Manokant, Consultant Anesthetist at Fernandez Hospital. Dr. Archana Deka from Assam, Guwahati, and myself, Dr. Aruna Parmeshwari, Professor and Head of Anesthesiology at SRMC. Over to Dr. Sunil Pandya.
Thank you, Aruna, for the wonderful introduction. As has been said, yes, this program, today's workshop has specifically targeted for our postgraduates and fraternity colleagues, keeping in mind the critical incidents and near misses that we encounter. If you look at the commonest causes of maternal mortality in our country, yes, hypertension, sepsis, hemorrhage kills. But many a times we see this in the process, certain medication errors, certain iatrogenic cause, which contribute to this morbidity and mortality. How do we prevent this? How do we minimize this? And these are the crises that we face day in and day out during our practice. So before I just go on, disclaimer, nil conflict of interest. And as I said during my introductory talk, special thanks to all my colleagues who are part of this workshop and also GVK MRI team, because this is where we conducted our simulation. And this is a team of GVK MRI, myself and Manokant, where we did the simulation things. Thank you, each one of you, GVK MRI, for this wonderful opportunity that we have had, and we'll be discussing about this station. So, greeting from Fernandez Hospital. As most of you know, this is a 320-bed tertiary care obstetric center with a dedicated obstetric critical care unit. The first of its kind, we started in 1998, and we have 6 dedicated ICU beds and 6 HDU beds and several recovery room beds. We run 24/7 acute pain management services, that is labor analysis services basically. And we also run postdoctoral fellowship course in obstetric anesthesia and PhD training program. So coming to critical incidents and crisis management, both go hand in hand. And managing critical events is one of the most challenging and important tasks that we anesthesiologists face in our life or in our practice. And ours is a unique specialty because whenever there is a crisis, the expectations from the bystanders, that is the surgeons and other colleagues, is almost 100% or near perfection. They want a landing score of 10. And we know that obstetric is a specialty of peculiarities. Basically, this is the population is relatively ASA grade 2 or healthy population. And more importantly, obstetric or cesarean sections are considered as social events. And it says, and if you look at a century ago or even a few decades ago, most of the deliveries used to happen in the at home or in the even the hut mats or in the forest or under the tree also. And slowly, yes, we are moving towards institutional care and hospitalization. But more importantly, the point which I want to emphasize is they are considered as social events. Importantly, this is the only specialty where emergencies outnumber elective procedures. If you look at the number of emergencies are almost 60 to 65%, and electives are around 40%. Of this, about 8 to 10% are stat procedures. That's stat category 1 cesarean section. So all these things amount to tremendous pressure on the anesthesiologist, because when there is an emergency, because of the several lives involved, at least two lives, if it's a singleton pregnancy, and it is a multi-fetal pregnancy, 2 or 3 lives, and the emotions they run high, the noise levels are high, and this is where you want to, they expect us to give a fantastic anesthesia with 100% safety. Importantly, other thing that is peculiar to this specialty is 70% of ICU admissions are unanticipated. That means when they conceive, they didn't expect that this patient might go to intensive care unit at the time of delivery or peri-delivery. We all know that obstetric, when it comes to anesthetic procedures, regional anesthesia is 8 to 10% safer than general anesthesia, and difficult airway incidence is almost 10 times high. 60% of obstetric procedures are unanticipated, as I said earlier. And importantly, at least about 40 to 50% of chunk of practice in some of the hospitals is painless deliveries, labor anesthesia. And we all know that labor anesthesia has a fantastic therapeutic role in complex deliveries or in high-risk patients. It enhances mental satisfaction. But importantly, labor analgesia is one procedure that mandates zero tolerance for any complications. Zero, because labor anesthesia is not mandatory for a low risk woman, but complication rates are not tolerated. Expectations from the mother and the family are sky high, and they expect, as I said, a perfect landing. So, with these peculiarities, coming to critical incidents and near misses, they are relatively, fortunately, rare but not uncommon. And task to reduce this anesthesia-related mental mortality has to be borne by the team, mostly the anesthesiologist, the obstetrician, the neonatologist, and the nurses, and everybody is involved. So basically, how do we aim for zero tolerance? That should be our primary goal. So coming to this critical incident, how do you define a critical incident? Critical incident is an incident in which a crisis has occurred and the patient or the staff member has experienced an adverse event, or an incident in which the patient or the staff member has just avoided an adverse event. It is a near miss. So basically, an incident that leads to adverse event. And if the patient recovers from that, it could be a near miss. Or near miss, if you want to look at the definition of near miss, it is an unplanned incident that did not result in injury, illness, or damage, but had the potential to do so. Only a fortunate break in the chain of events prevented injury, fatality, or damage, or serious morbidity, or death. In other words, a miss that was nonetheless very near. So basically, if you look at if you miss this chain of events, it may end up with a serious morbidity or sometimes mortality. So whenever you face this crisis, how do you define this crisis? Basically, crisis is nothing but a time of great danger or trouble whose outcome decides whether possible bad consequences follow or not. And it's typically a brief, intense event of sequence of events that offers a clear or present threat to the patient's life. And whenever there's a incident, critical incident, or a near miss or a crisis, it requires active response from the team to prevent the injury, because it is unlikely that it may resolve on its own. Importantly, as I said earlier, near misses, critical incidents, and crisis can lead to double jeopardy, because not only the mother but neonate also is at risk. And importantly, we have to remember that a cardiac arrest can either lead to complete recovery if the unit institute has good systems, good protocols, or if the protocols are poor, it may result in permanent vegetative state or a mortality. So critical incidents, if you look at the historical aspects, it was first described by Flanagan in 1954, mostly in the aircraft training process. And if you look at the sequence of events that leads to critical incident, is a complex amalgam. Like if you consider a neuraxial block or a general anesthetic and a parturient who is coming for cesarean section or for labor anesthesia, there is always an element of human error or judgmental shortfalls, or technical compromise, equipment malfunction, or drug delivery system, clubbed with Patient-related factors or category of cesarean section, as I said about stat sections, definitely are more dangerous, especially if the patient is high BMI, difficult airway, or a compromised patient with comorbidities or not stabilized patients, unstabilized patients. Administrative causes, poor triaging, lack of standard protocols. Especially in big institutes with number of deliveries, there is a possibility that there might be 4 or 5 sections simultaneously or 2 or 3 sections simultaneously, and this is where triage is necessary. Which patient needs a priority? Many a times, the clinical condition may not be the reason for proper triage. It can be something else. So proper triage is very, very important. So the human factors, technical factors, plus patient characteristic, lack of standard protocols can lead to critical incident. So if you look at the overall problem of critical incident, basically system related issues like equipment malfunction, underlying patient comorbidities, surgical issues like technically unskilled or a poorly skilled surgeon or a poorly skilled or compromised technically compromised anesthesia personnel can be the triggers leading to a critical incident. And if you detect, you can minimize it. If you correct, you can minimize. But if it goes undetected or uncorrected, then it can result in adverse outcome. If you look at the paper, which was a prospective internal audit by Udita and Athai in IGA that was published in 2009, about 19% of critical incidents were related to obs and gynae, and mostly about 80 to 90% were because of obstetric procedures. And when they have broken up the number of incidents into different categories, the most common were circuit-related issues, syringe swap, medication errors, premature extubation, malfunction, wrong choice of drugs, so on and so forth. But importantly, the associated factors that led to this critical incident is failure to check, failure to check, first experience the situation, inadequate experience, or inattention, carelessness. All these things, there are several causes that can lead to this incident. So this was one of the pivotal study done in 2001, I think 2002, where they have promoted the safety of anesthesia. Today, anesthesia as a specialty is considered to be the most safest or highest category of safety standards compared to all other specialties. It's number one amongst all medical and surgical specialties. The safety issues are more concerned to this specialty when compared to others. So with this background, what I want to narrate is I want to take up few cases from my own institute that we have encountered in our practice, which are mostly, I would say 100% are near misses, but had a potential disaster for a mortality and a serious morbidity as well. So this was the case which came at 11:45 p.m. Typically, most of these things happen in the night, early hours or night, this thing. So this is a case of HELLP syndrome of our emergency cesarean section referred in the night. And because of coagulopathy, my colleague who was on duty, he is a very competent person, a cardiac anesthetist, with little experience in obstetric, but a very competent person. And when I left at around 8 p.m., he said, Sunil, this case might come and just manage if necessary, just call me. And he said, it's a BMI of 26, 60 kilos straight away, should not be a problem. And he took up the patient without bothering me in the night. Unfortunately, despite Malampati 2, it was a difficult intubation, but he could manage to put a tube in the third attempt. It was surprising for him that a straightforward, thin patient, 60 kilos, Malampati grade 2, suddenly ending up with difficult intubation. He didn't anticipate. Unfortunately, he, being a cardiac anesthetist, he had poor understanding of underlying pathophysiology. He extubated the patient on table. Inadequate attempts was re-intubated. And then he called me and said, just ventilate the patient. She may be having metabolic acidosis. And ABG revealed indeed acute kidney injury with severe metabolic acidosis. We stabilized the patient. Next day morning, we extubated. She was quite okay. Attendant was counseled again by a junior colleague stating that she is fine. We'll shift her to out of ICU after 24 hours because she was on magnesium sulfate being HELLP syndrome with preeclampsia. Maxelf, labetalol, etc. were on. Unfortunately, at around 4 p.m., she suffers a cardiac arrest. Luckily, she was in ICU and we could revive her. So if you look at the critical incident, the problem, the patient has a problem which you have failed to recognize, it has become an incident with an adverse outcome. So this is where we need to identify the problem and see that we break this chain of events in order to prevent the adverse outcome. And more importantly, the adverse outcome happens because it's not only one incident, but it's a series of failures at multiple levels, at the consultant level, at the registrar level, at the nursing level, at the housekeeping level, or the administrative level. Multiple levels, factors can occur, and it may end up with a trajectory for accident opportunity, and patient may end up with a critical incident. So basically, whenever there is a cardiac arrest, it's crisis management, and crisis management is nothing but performance stress, under stress, and time pressure. You just have got 3 to 4 minutes for the mother to awaken or achieve ROSC. In order to, fortunately, this was a postpartum or post-operative case, so PMCD was not an issue. But luckily, we could revive her. The thing is, medical knowledge and skills are of paramount importance, but they are not enough. More importantly, skill is important. So if you look at the things that can lead to adverse event, is some of the hazardous attitude of the clinicians that are present in your team, like anti-authority. They know everything, macho type of a person, and you need to take care of this personnel, and we need to be averse so that they need some sort of counseling. So when we did a root cause analysis, why this cardiac arrest happened, basically the magnesium infusion on the volumetric pump, which was supposed to go at 20 ml per hour, was set at 200 ml per hour by the junior nurse. We got it out because when she had cardiac arrest, we thought we'll stop magnesium sulfate, and the entire bottle was empty. I said, so why the bottle is empty? Then we looked, it was going at 200 ml per hour. So basically, background of acute kidney injury, hypermagnesemia, and cardiac arrest. So lesson that we learned from this case is, one may be a competent anesthesiologist, but understanding underlying pathophysiology is of paramount importance. Titrated anesthetic probably would have been helped her recover fast rather than ending up with elective ventilation. More importantly, monitoring the nurses' infusion settings is also very, very important in ICU, because many times we feel that a registrar is there, a consultant is there, he must have seen, but we rely so much sometimes on the staff, and we may end up with a morbidity. So other thing that was done is junior consultant or a junior registrar counsel attendance signals will shift the patient by within 24 hours. Everything is fine. So other thing that is very important is, whenever the patient is in ICU, don't say everything is hunky-dory. Always give a little guarded prognosis. So this was a patient of neomis ending up with cardiac arrest, but fortunately recovered and was discharged home without much of an issue. The second case was a hypertensive parturient shifted for emergency cesarean section, category 2. She was in magnesium sulfate. Subarachnoid block was given. It was uneventful. Patient was obtunded, and unfortunately, she improved with 100% oxygen. And then I said, why don't you start Maxelf, which has come from labor room, magnesium sulfate, so that we continue. Generally, we continue as a protocol magnesium sulfate intraoperative, so that we can prevent or minimize perioperative seizures. When we looked at the infusion, no infusion bottle was found. When we did a soul searching, we found out that the patient became obtunded because the bottle, the co-load fluid that we gave contained magnesium sulfate. So Maxelf infusion, about 25 grams of magnesium sulfate in 450 ml of Ringal lactate, we use as a co-load, because there was no label on the bottle. So again, it was a major medication error on the part of the nurse, who added 25 grams of magnesium sulfate, shifted the patient to the theater, and we use a Ringal lactate as a co-load before spinal, and then we gave 25 grams. Fortunately, kidneys were working good. Nothing happened, but it was a case of improper communication and poor test and then protocols of the hospital were breached by not putting the label. Fortunately, she recovered completely without much of an issue. This was a very interesting case. The third case, labor epidural was given in a primary gravida because of high VAS on maternal request. Epidural was uneventful, single pass. we activated the catheter with low dose mixture with bupivacaine and fentanyl. And after about 8 ml of low dose mixture was given as an incremental doses, patient through a tonic and clonic seizure, and patient recovered fortunately completely within 5 minutes. So seizure following 8 milligrams of bupivacaine, was it local anesthetic systemic toxicity or was it intrapartum eclampsia? We looked at the antenatal record. There is no history of hypertension, no history of preeclampsia. Even before epidural, blood pressure was normal. So was it last? Luckily, for us, post-ictal BP recording was 140/90, urine albumin was 1 plus, and we presume that it could be intrapartum eclampsia. So magnesium sulfate loading dose was given, and unfortunately, patient also had pain relief with 8 ml, like VAS, which was 8, became 3. For fetal indication, she was taken up for cesarean section after about an hour or so because of presumed fetal compromise. So when the patient came to theater, we activated the catheter with an anesthetic dose, 2% lignocaine with adrenaline, fentanyl, and soda bicarb. And when we injected the drug, again she threw a tonic and clonic seizure. Then we called the surgeon. Surgeon was doing or closing the abdomen in the other theater. She said, just I'll take 5 minutes. So we thought once the surgeon comes, we'll give general anesthesia because of second episode of GTCS. But by the time the surgeon came, patient was having decent amount of analgesia because already 8 ml of lignocaine had gone in. Then we slowly topped up, and luckily we could complete the surgery under epidural without much of an issue. We examined the patient thoroughly in the postoperative period. She was having ptosis and ophthalmoplegia. So was it intrapartum eclampsia or coincidental leading to intracranial bleed because ophthalmoplegia and ptosis is there? Or is it local anesthetic systemic toxicity with raised ICP? We are a little intrigued. But by background, we thought she must be having a cerebral sinus thrombosis, must not be investigated, and we're planning for investigation. So we thought we'll get an MRI done. And we planned for an MRI on the second post-op day. She was having a large asymptomatic intracranial space occupying lesion with acoustic neuroma with a compression of midbrain and hydrocephalus, which resulted in high ICP, and we knew now the cause of seizure. But imagine this patient who was relatively asymptomatic. Had she come to theater straight away for cesarean section, and we have done a PAC just before surgery, and had we given spinal, most of the time we give regional anesthesia, what would have been the consequence? Could she have herniated and died, or cardiac arrest? We would not have known the cause. So the point which I want to highlight is, pregnant patient, despite gross pathology, they appear to be normal, they appear to be stable. So we should not, we need to really have a proper PAC, probe into it so that we don't miss out any of this pathology. She came back, she had acoustic neuroma excision, and subsequently 2 years later, she came back for subsequent second pregnancy. And you can see the pseudo meningocele here. Luckily, this time also we did under CSC a combined spinal epidural, and she ended up. She was quite happy. The family was happy. So the point that I want to highlight with case 3 is asymptomatic space occupying lesion which was asymptomatic, and epidural leading to seizure could have been blamed, or epidural could have been blamed. This was a similar case which happened 2 months after the previous asymptomatic case. When I gave a top up, it was me who gave the epidural. She had a momentary eyeballs were rolled up. So when I asked the mother, it was a labor epidural in a primary gravida, uneventful procedure. When the top up was given, the eyeballs rolled upwards. So I asked the mother, who was generally we do epidurals in the labor room with the mother or the mother-in-law or the husband by the side. So when I asked the mother, she said, "Haibat mein hai to aisa hi karte." That means whenever she is anxious or hyperventilates, the eyeball roll up. So I was not happy with this. Then I did a thorough CNS assessment, absolutely normal. I called the physician. Well, I just have a look at the CNS system. She said, "Sir, just because the last case, don't think every patient has a space occupying lesion." And it was in fact within normal limits. Patient landed up for cesarean section in the at around 10 p.m. I counseled my colleague to be careful while giving a top up. And when he gave a top up for cesarean section, she had a similar rolling of eyeballs for about 15 seconds, but nothing happened. So next day morning, I called the neurophysician to have a look at her. She said everything is fine. I don't think anything is necessary. The patient mother said, "Sir, आप बार बार क्यों पूछ रहे हैं आप? कुछ है क्या उनको?" Then I said, "If affordability is not an issue, just get an MRI done." And she got an MRI, and again, this was a large space occupying lesion. So basically, the point which I want to convey is you have to be a very keen observer. Otherwise, you may miss these things and it can become a critical incident. So basically, because we identified the problem, it was self-limited and we could avert a critical incident, an adverse outcome. Otherwise, you would have had a raised ICP, thrown a fit, and then gone to neuro center, then it would have been little late. So vigilance is of paramount importance to prevent near miss as a critical incident. This was again a very interesting case, not a critical incident, but the point which I want to highlight is whenever you have VIPs, like patient is an ophthalmologist, husband is a surgeon, primary epidural was given for delivery, uneventful procedure, uneventful delivery. On the first postnatal day, legs are numb, she's not able to walk. A senior colleague of mine did a bedside assessment and she became a little apprehensive because she felt it's a patient is just not moving, legs are numb, and she felt there is something that has to be intervened. And she wanted second opinion from the team. So surgeon's patient husband is a surgeon. He called his first friend who was an orthopedic surgeon, and he saw the patient that it's a Koda Equina syndrome and advised MRI. Can we please? Sorry. So the surgeon has labeled Koda Equina syndrome in the case sheet. He wrote the notes. The attendants are furious. They wanted to go elsewhere. So that's when we came into picture. So because Koda Equina syndrome was documented, my colleague asked the patient to go for CT or MRI, but we examined the patient. Patient was elected for workup. So what we did is we examined the patient. There is no sensory deficit. There is no motor deficit. She's able to move her toes up and down. Ankle flexion is good, but she's just not able to flex her knees, flex her thighs. Then when we went to the obstetric details, GDM baby, large for gestational age, forceps delivery, and she was recovering with the baby recovered with physio, having little Bell's palsy, shoulder palsy. So when we did an X-ray, this is what was found. Like pelvic diastasis. So large for gestational age, use of forceps, leading to pubis symphysis, pubis separation, leading to severe suprapubic pain and in causing inability to walk because of pain. So the Koda Equina syndrome was, we didn't do any neurological studies or any ENMG. We just gave her pain relief, physiotherapy, strapped the pelvis, and she recovered. The point which I want to again advise is, just because some specialists say something, yes, medico-legally we have to get an MRI or this thing done, but you should be a good perioperative physician so that you can minimize this investigations and unnecessary anxiety amongst the family. So basically, crisis management of critical incidents requires soft skills, social skills. It's a teamwork. Good communication skills are paramount importance, and more importantly, a closed-loop communication is what is important. Problem-solving skills, ethics, adaptability, interpersonal skills, and importantly, certain cognitive skills are very, very important. So generally, we keep these charts in every floor, so that they have an idea about assessment whenever there is a bedside issue, so that the dermatomal mapping can be properly done. It is very difficult for the cross-T, we remember, but when it comes to specific dermatome, unless we have these cognitive aids, it's very difficult to say which dermatome is involved. So we keep this chart in every nursing station, and so far it has been used only for academic purpose. Fortunately, nothing to the patient. But importantly, what I want to emphasize is, As an anesthesiologist, we also need to know about dermatomal mapping. This was a beautiful case I want to highlight because you can know at the end of the case. See, I got a call from the neurologist consultant. He's a neurosurgeon. And he called, Sunil, I'm sending you a patient. It seems you have given the spinal about 1 month back, and patient is having diplopia, lateral rectus palsy. You give a blood patch, it is PDPH. He put a diagnosis, PDPH on paper, and needs epidural blood patch, and patient was referred to us. I was little I was little concerned. And when I went through the record, we maintain a record of every patient. I only happened to give anesthesia. It was a 29 gauge Whittaker spinal needle, single pass, uneventful. Well, a Whittaker needle causing PDPH is something strange. But anyway, we saw the patient. Patient was having bilateral rectus palsy, both the right and left eye. I was not happy, so I centered the patient for an MRI with MR venogram and MR angiography. Everything was normal. Then PDPH, there is no headache, there is no postural radiation. But yes, definitely because of lateral rectus palsy, she has diplopia. Well, MRI brain was normal, MRI was normal. What do we do next? I sent the patient to a neurophysician rather than a neurosurgeon. And then it turned out to be ocular myasthenia gravis. Postpartum ocular myasthenia gravis. Imagine just because a specialist had written advised epidural blood patch, and you give a blood patch to this lady without much of an issue, with myasthenia gravis, it could have worsened. So the problem, the thing which I want to highlight is, you may end up with a critical incident or a near miss because of advice given by others who themselves may not be on a firm ground. So be your own physician, but at the same time, take help from a competent physician. So basically, bedside neuroassessment also is a thing which we need to learn, and create a good team of physicians around you, neurophysician or a neurosurgeon or a cardiologist or a nephrologist, whomever you know, because it's not that I can replace cardiologist or a neurophysician. No, we cannot replace. We are not the specialist. At the same time, if as far as perioperative things are concerned, as far as anesthesia is concerned, you have much better idea when compared to what they know about our specialty. So this is what I wanted to highlight with this case. I'll quickly finish up this cases. Other cases again, epidural was given in a primary gravida without much of an issue. She had stuffy nose, ptosis, upper lip weakness, numb face. What is it? Well, it was a Horner syndrome. Not uncommon. Rarely you see this, especially if the catheter, multiple attempts, obese patients, multiple attempts, part of the catheter can go in the subdural space, and you have rostral spread of drug, and you end up with a Horner syndrome. Yes, whenever you have a Horner syndrome, do not give any top-ups, reset the catheter, because there is a potential possibility of catheter going intrathecally, and you may end up with a total spinal. This is a case where patient ended up with a total spinal after 8th dose. Like it became, no, sorry. This was a case where uneventful combined spinal epidural was given. And when epidural top-up was given, patient, it became a total spinal. So whenever you are doing a combined spinal epidural for the surgical theater, ensure that the post-operative period, first epidural activation top-up is given by the anesthesiologist only, not by the nurse. Very, very important is what we learn. So activation of epidural catheter after CACA should be by the anesthesiologist, and only graded doses, not a bolus dose. This was again a VIP patient whose husband was a doctor, a general surgeon in a corporate hospital. She got 4 top-ups for labor anesthesia, uneventful, was taken up for section for obstetric indication. We gave a surgical dose, uneventful. In the post-operative ward, we gave manual intermittent boluses for pain relief, uneventful. But the 8th dose or 9th dose, it became, the catheter migrated into intrathecal compartment. So basically, the point which I want to highlight is, true migration of epidural catheter can happen after the first top-up or even the 10th top-up. So every dose or every top-up that you give has to be given incrementally, and it has to be like a test dose. So true intrathecal migration inadvertent intravenous migration can happen, and you have to be vigilant. So epidural, even a simple straightforward 60 kilo patient, it may end up with a disaster, and you need to be very careful. So epidural can migrate after the first dose, after the 10 dose, or it may not migrate at all. But you need to remember that epidural catheter can enter into intradural, subdural, intrathecal compartment, and the dynamics you need to remember. Otherwise, you may end up with a disaster. Again, this was a patient where epidural was cited on request at almost about, I think, 9 centimeters dilatation. Patient had mild discomfort, and this is a partial IV and partial epidural. Basically, the point which I want to highlight is this patient had partial epidural and partial intravenous subclinical localized toxicity. So basically, partial migration of epidural catheter into the intravenous compartment. This was for student with who wanted no drug labor, natural birth. After 14 hours of labor, she got exhausted and requested epidural at 9 centimeters dilatation. Uneventful epidural, monitored as per the protocol. But importantly, after 30 minutes, she was so deeply sedated, and nurse said she's hardly arousable. Luckily, when I went to see her, the attending clinician, obstetrician said, I think, Sunil, 15 hours, okay, I will just do a section because even the fetal trace is abnormal last 6 hours. It was like presumed fetal compromise. So when the patient came to theater, we thought she's respiratory rate is around 8 to 10 per minute. We thought, is it respiratory depression? We gave naloxone, no improvement. Examination revealed weakness of both the upper limbs. She was sweating profusely. We did a blood gas, it was 89, like respiratory acidosis was there. So we put a LMA, assisted ventilation, and cesarean section was uneventful. We just gave a little, about 6 ml of lignocaine with adrenaline and bicarb. She was able to move both the legs, but weakness in hands and numbness of the face. So basically, subdural placement of catheter again. The point which I want to highlight is these are the things that catheter can be misplaced, misadventure without any knowledge. So the feedback that we got from the patient was she was extremely happy. And she said everyone should take it, but we know what has happened to her. So the lesson that we learned is examination of vitals at least for 30 minutes after every dose instead of 20 minutes. So generally we used to see patient for 20 minutes, but after this case, we thought we should monitor closely for about at least 30 minutes. I think there are several other interesting cases. I'll end up with this thing, but more importantly, the point which I want to highlight is debriefing. Whenever you have a critical incident or a crisis management, you need to do a debriefing. Involve all the staff that were involved in the patient management and see that you pat everybody for excellent teamwork. It's very, very important. And use a delta approach rather than using a bad terminology, good this thing, what bad you did or what good you did. So basically, what is there any way we could have done better? Or something of that sort. And importantly, institutionalized protocol is very, very important. Follow institute protocol, good documentation, and always good communication. These are just our statistics. This is, of course, the old presentation, 2017. Total obstetric epidurals are 77,000. If you see the incidence of subdural block, 1 in 7,000, 1 in 38,000, total spinal, 1 in 38,000 again. So Horner syndrome, 1 in 25,000, very, very rare. But all these cases that I have discussed had the potential for a morbidity or a mortality had it gone undetected. And coming to general anesthesia, luckily we had used LMA as a rescue in 11 cases. Anaphylaxis in 2, awareness under general was nil, unplanned ICU admissions was 5. But what I want to emphasize is major neurological sequelae, even after a lack of epidurals, were nil. So epidural is very safe, provided you are vigilant, you are aware of what you are doing, and you know the consequences of or when to pick up a adverse event. So near misses or critical incidents can occur secondary to multiple attempts, difficult technique, failure to appreciate subtle physiological changes, failure to identify comorbid conditions, and fatigue component also is important. Most importantly, it follows uneventful procedure. It follows an uneventful procedure. This is just a reference, like Jenkins et al. Is a fantastic compilation of 145,000 epidurals, where they have studied the different problems, and we compared our data with their data. And if you see the incidence of subdural of in the published literature from the UK, 1 in 4,200, ours is 2,000, 2020 to 55. Intravenous migration is 1 in 5,000, it is 1 in 15,000, so on and so forth. So basically, Horner syndrome, all these things, this Jenkins paper is very, very good paper. I think each one of you should know. And also NAP 3 audit, National Anesthesia Project Audit 3. This is a fantastic review, again published by AAGVI UK, where they have analyzed the adverse event produced because of regional anesthesia. And when I went through the details, about 45% were because of optic indications, the adverse events following neuraxial block. But one good thing is permanent neuraxial injury following neuraxial block is very, very rare as per this audit. And whenever those incidents which occurred, 50% and more were associated with epidurals. That means spinals are safer, epidurals are relatively unsafe. And CSCA also were associated with more injuries. But if you look at the number of CSCA compared to spinal epidural are very less in number, so it was inconclusive. But important conclusion of this NAP audit was major cause of permanent injury was avoidable, and they occurred because of organizational deficiencies, failure to identify or lack of insight, and delayed cross reference. So eyes cannot see what mind does not know, should not happen. Delayed cross, whenever there's a problem, see that you refer to appropriate physician. Just mere referring to appropriate physician is not important. See that you close the loop. Suppose if you ask for a neuro consultation, we know that if there is a neuraxial hematoma that is suspected, it has to be evacuated within 8 to 12 hours. So you have to get an MRI done, MRI with gadolinium contrast, and see that the patient undergoes decompressive laminectomy. All has to happen within 8 to 12 hours. We know that if you want to have a good outcome. So delayed cross referrals and all this, you need to have a institute protocol and cognitive aids available in your hospital, and a critical incident registry if possible in the hospital, so that you can identify. So crisis prevention is very important. In our hospital, we ensure that all top-ups are given by anesthesiologist, preferably by an anesthetist. But yes, in our hospital also, the current generation, they rely on the labor ward nurses. They site the epidural, they give 1 or 2 top-ups, subsequently it's taken over by the midwife or the nurse. So, but anesthesia is available around the clock. Maternal fetal monitoring is important at least for 30 minutes. Strict monitoring protocol of patient and availability of anesthetist to reach the patient in 2 to 3 minutes in case if there is a problem. There should be a high index of suspicion of complications, especially with previous back surgeries, multiple attempts. Call for help, not more than 3 attempts, even in the night time. If the patient having difficult back, call for the consultant, experienced consultant for setting an epidural. Thread the catheter to the desired length to prevent knotting. Enhance organizational learning, improve quality of care, improve safety. And this is where administrative aspects also come into place. So key point in anesthesia crisis management is knowing the environment, anticipated plan, allocation of attention wisely, mobilization resources, use of cognitive aids, and basically good effective communication within the team. So I conclude my talk with this last case, which was a very good case. This was a rare near miss. I have presented this case at race earlier. This was a patient who was wheeled in our ICU with severe excruciating headache. GCS is 15, and the surgeon says, sir, eclampsia fits angle, let us do a section, cesarean section. BP was under 90, but she was just pleading for pain relief. When we examined the patient, she was having lateral rectus palsy. So my colleague said, shall we give spinal? She's awake. I said, let us evaluate. So when I asked the surgeon, fetal evaluation, then she said, fetal evaluation is fairly okay. Then I said, if it is fetal evaluation is okay, it's not a category 1 section or a category 2 section. Let us get a CT scan done of the brain, at least before we indulge in spinal or general anesthesia. So this is where categorization of section is paramount importance. When we got a CT scan done, this is what we found. She was Patient was shot by her husband through the nostril, and there was a bullet in the brain. And the in-laws family wanted to die during surgery. Luckily, she came out of surgery. We did both cesarean section and craniotomy. She recovered completely. Of course, she has of rhinorrhea. That goes without saying. But she recovered from that, and subsequently, the family also got patched up. But the point which I want to highlight again is bedside clinical assessment. And just because the surgeon has told she needs cesarean section doesn't mean that she needs cesarean section immediately. Categorize a section. She is having lateral rectus palsy. Lateralizing sign is there. If there is a time, evaluate the patient. And unforeseen reason, let us say that there is a category 1 section with lateral rectus palsy, and if you are giving GA, if at all you are giving GA, do not extubate this patient on table. Look at the pupil size in the intraoperatively and see that before you extubate, you shift her to radiology suite directly after the surgery and do a CT or MR and then plan for extubation. There may be nothing in the brain, but when the patient has lateralizing sign, it is always better to follow a safe protocol. And one of the things that we follow judiciously in a hospital is the dashboard, dynamic audit, which helps us to upgrade our standards continuously. So, in a nutshell, critical incident and near misses, they occur in day-to-day life. They are not very rare, but not uncommon. So, team training, institutional protocol, continuous skill upgradation, improving yourself or our colleagues' skills and knowledge immediately, results in improved outcome. So, take-home messages can occur with highly skilled anesthesiologists. It warrants close metal and fetal monitoring. Every top-up should be given by the anesthesiologist in a fractionated ways. Prompt recognition and treatment is very important to break this chain of events. And risk management strategies, clinical risk management meetings, clinical audit should be in place in all the units, and standardized protocols and difficult airway equipment, because we know that if the general anesthetic airway disasters are the most common cause of critical incident. Importantly, every system should have a protocol of breaking the bad news. Never stand in the corridor and break the bad news. See that the family people come, sit in the quiet room, and you also come, all the entire team comes and slowly break the bad news. At the same time, taking care of the second victim is nothing but the anesthesiologist. Because we know that every morbidity, serious morbidity or maternal mortality, we know that how anesthesiologist feels, and taking care of him is of paramount importance. So to conclude, I would say that it is easier to stay out of the trouble than get out of trouble. So staying out of trouble is of paramount importance than creating a trouble and trying to get out of it. So let us be a part of this patient celebrations. Thank you very much. Thank you. Over to you, Aruna.